Hey, good afternoon from my little office in the sky. Today I'm going to provide a lecture with some information, and you'll be responsible for looking at the videos. I try to incorporate them within this context, but unfortunately my Zoom keeps crashing. So when I have a place where I'll say stop, stop the lecture, go into Blackboard, review the video, and then we'll go forward from there. So today what we're going to do is look at students with visual impairment. Before I start, I just want to let you all know that I'm available for Zoom one-to-one meetings if you're concerned with anything going on. I chose to give you guys a couple of more asynchronous lectures to give you time to digest information, work with other things. So just know that I'm available Monday to Friday. Give me a text or an email and request some times, and I'll get back to you. So that's kind of checking in. So today what we're going to do is look at understanding children with visual impairments. And overall, really, there are different degrees and limitations, although limitations is one of those words that is more on the negative side. So think about the different learning challenges that maybe these students have. We have some specifically designed instruction, and typically many of the services that are afforded students under this category are given by other service providers, such as mobility experts, Braille experts. We'll talk a little bit about teaching and planning for daily living, as well as some discussion, at least from my side, to explain some of the accommodations. This is a fabulous video. I want you to stop the lecture, review this. It's listed in Blackboard, and then do a self-quiz to yourself. Answer these questions, and then come back. Hey, you're back. I hope you appreciated the discussion with Matthew and his ability to create some amazing Lego architecture. When we look at students with low vision and blindness in the US, we look at a general population that's relatively small. Overall, it's considered a low incidence disability. There is a strong effort to serve students in their local schools, again, keeping them within their neighborhoods. There are some residential models that still exist for those who are blind, but many of those are closing or changing their missions because of the isolation factor that was going on. And I know that the book talks a little bit more about the history of this, and I'd like you to be aware of that. And again, it is really in regards to how we view all people who are learning challenged and who need additional support and yet also need to be part of our society in general. When we're defining visual impairment, and again in the piece you just saw, they spoke a bit about the challenges and issues of what it looks like. The blindness is set by a physical standard of vision, and that is less than 20/20 vision. Our acuity of how we see is based on 20/20, and I'm sorry, I misspoke. That statistics should be, and let me uncover it here, less than 2,200. They cannot really use vision for learning, but there may be some residual responsiveness to light. Low vision is considered after correction to be between 2070 and 2200. Individuals who have this designation have a difficulty accomplishing visual tasks, but learn through some visual sense with our amazing technology. And as we always do, go back to the IDEA definition, and this is how it adversely affects a child's education and their performance within that realm in terms of both partially sighted and blindness. The one thing that I want to point out to you is that most children are identified by both parents and physicians long before they enter school because of our medical screening. And in preschool, most of our states require some sort of a vision screening for our preschool kids. These look familiar, hopefully, to most of you, and they're different eye charts that are used for different purposes. Just a little bit in terms of just a review here. I'm not going to go into the anatomy specifically of how an eye functions because I do believe that the book reviews that well enough for you to understand, but it is important for us to understand that within the context of the different types of blindness because there's a physical component why a child may be blind, and there also is a brain component. So a child could have physically functioning eyes, and yet because of damage in the brain, they cannot see. One of the things that I think I want you to understand is that these are, again, extraordinarily generalized characteristics. It is really important, again, as we consider children without disabilities to be individuals, that we consider children with disabilities to be individuals. And there are lots of ranges in terms of their experience, in terms of their ability to get around, in terms of how they interact with the environment. And it all has to do with how they function in the world. The one thing that's difficult to supply children with visual impairments in the same way that sighted children learn is the fact that there's a certain amount of what we call incidental learning. And that comes from the nature of we learn from the things that are around us visually. Think about all of the input that you've gotten from the time that you were born. And some of those things do impact the development of motor skills, language skills, cognition, as well as social skills. Think of all of the visual cues that we as sighted individuals look for in our day-to-day conversation. Also, think about when we've talked in class how nonverbal communication really does have an impact on how we perceive messages coming in. Think about how you read a text, and partly with the emojis that we have, we understand the intent of the messages that we're reading. But if we don't understand the intent oftentimes because there's no context to what that is, we could perceive some of those messages in a wrong or different way than the person who's speaking them intended or texting them. So determining causation, there are a couple of different ways. And if you think about the way that we've spoken in terms of children with autism, children with other learning disabilities, things may occur at birth or before our visual memories have been established. And again, those could be genetic, those could be premature births, or infectious diseases. Noting those types of things, you also have individuals who had normal vision at birth, and depending on when something happened in the environment or due to things like cancer or injuries, they acquire a vision loss. One of the common causes for visual impairment for children here in the United States continues to be some sort of congenital infection. There possibly may be some sort of cortical visual impairment. And again, I referred to that earlier when we were looking at the diagram of the anatomy of the eye. It has to do with the vision part of the brain, not the vision part of the eye. Something called retinopathy of prematurity can also happen, or ROP, and an incomplete retina is a result because we are susceptible right after birth to an infusion of oxygen or lack of oxygen, especially in preterm infants. So children who are born prematurely may have problems with retinal development. And again, because they're born prior to that typical sequence of development in the womb, there can be issues as a result of that. There's also an optic nerve hypoplasia, which is about the development of the optic nerve. So it's not actually the eye itself, but it's the optic nerve that goes between the eye and the brain. So lots of different types of reasons and causes. Just noting, there typically albinoism, which is, again, it's a genetic result of an inheritance of recessive genes. It happens maybe 1 in 20,000 individuals. They may have visual impairment and optic atrophy. And what happens is that it's basically the end stage of the pathway between the retina and the lateral geneticulate, which could be caused from glaucoma, could be caused from inflammation of the optic nerve, and basically from underdevelopment. When you go to your eye doctor or have your eyes examined, typically you get some sort of test for glaucoma, which is about the pressure in the eye. And that ensures that you have a healthy eye going forward. So what I want you to do right now is stop the video. As we would maybe in class, you get to turn to our partner and discuss different things and share with each other ideas in terms of how do you define visual impairment? How prevalent is it in the United States? Identifying and tell me some of the characteristics and what might the causes be. So what I'd like you to do right now or later is to jot down a couple of these things, because these are really important to note as we go forward in our discussion. So stop the video. Hey, we're back again. It's kind of funny, huh? Stop, start, stop, start. We're going to talk about evaluating students. And again, as I said before, early identification is extraordinarily important, and typically that's done by parents and physicians. There is a preschool screening that is the norm here in the United States that might afford some of those kids who slip through the cracks. The other piece is that there's a comprehensive vision assessment, and that's why it's really important for our parents and to go forward and know that they have those things done by a qualified ophthalmologist. Our eyesight is extraordinarily important to our vision and our learning. There is a video on Blackboard that talks about the how we prevent this, and it's by a doctor, and it's a very interesting video because of how he, well, I won't give it away. It is an optional video. Typically also in evaluating students who we also do know who are in our school settings, that it's done by what's called a VI teacher, a vision impairment teacher, or possibly an orientation and mobility specialist. And they provide what's known as a functional visual assessment that allows them to set in place those other related services that we talk about so often. And we'll talk about it a little bit later in this lecture. And also, what kind of media does the child need? Do they need Braille? Do they need print? Do they need audio tapes? All of the different appropriate learning mediums, so we can set in place successful learning environments for our students. You can stop this at any time. This is just a really interesting national agenda of goals. And it involves things that we've talked about throughout the semester. How do we create places for early referral all the way to professional development for our people out in the field? When we talk about designing specifically designed instruction and services, again, it's going to depend on where that student is on the continuum in terms of their blindness and or low vision. And you have to think in terms of what kinds of skills that they require, what kind of compensatory skills. In other words, what do we afford them in their learning environment to be able to learn when they have one avenue that they do not use or cannot use. And also orientation and mobility skills. And that's getting around in the world. Informal assessments include, how they're going to function independently. The assessments need to be age appropriate of the different tasks that we have out there in the learning environment as well as the non-learning environment. And again, the importance is to not make assumptions about a child's acquired learning to the point where we're not really seeing the whole picture of the child. So when you talk about an expanded core curriculum, if you look at the different types of skills involved, it's about career, it's about using assistive technology, it's about what kind of sensory skills do they have. In other words, if they have any remaining vision in their eyes. Do we need to provide different tactile learning platforms like Braille or different types of graphics, magnifiers, etc. So at some point in time, take a stop and look at these different things, because again, it has to do with a variety of learning opportunities and curriculum that we provide our students. One of the most important things to understand is that when we talk about educational needs for all of our students who have disabilities, and it takes into account not just their success in general education curriculum, but it also needs to take into account their non-academic priorities on which the services may focus on. Things like mobility, teaching them the technology that they need to use to be successful. Where are those services going to be given? Oftentimes, you look at mobility teachers who come in and do pull-out sessions with students. It might be something in terms of an off-site support that's given to these students. There are lots of different related services that these students are provided. The other thing that the IEP team needs to remember is the ways in which they communicate to meet the student needs. In other words, if there are multiple people who are working with the student for their success, how does that communication happen in a fluid and collaborative way? When we, again, continuing this process of talking about related services, there could be a multitude of things that we afford in the classroom, from anything from using counters like abacuses to reading with Braille. Now think about it, that has to be taught. You also have issues when you have second language learners involved. The IEP team, as well as the related services with the parents, also work through the determination of what's the non-academic priorities. Again, that could be mobility, that could be providing a number of opportunities for them to have places and spaces that they are given to access what we all take for granted. Where are the locations for those services? And again, how do you meet the needs of that student? When we look at providing adaptive materials, and it's such an amazing piece that there are so many things out there now that even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, were not available. There are printed materials out there that have been in place for a very long time to provide print material for the blind. What kind of authentic materials can we give them? What kind of optical devices? In the classrooms that I had a student who was very low vision, and what was brought in was actually a camera that was housed in a device that we slid books underneath, and the screen would allow him to look at them and read them in a very large magnified format. Lots of different assistive technology things. Again, the things that we have in technology today surpasses anything from year to year that any of us could possibly imagine in terms of assistance. Text to speech, how do you create audio books? How do you create closed captioning for, no, sorry, wrong thing, thinking about closed captioning here. How do you provide different things? We want to increase the amount of experiential activities that we give these students. Again, it's about having hands-on experiences. They may not be able to see something, but they can feel things. And again, it's about creating a curriculum of learning by doing, which, if you think about it, is how many of us learn anyway. Going through the process of looking at RTI, it's really a process of at what level are services provided at Tier 1 within the general education setting by the vision specialist, by the orientation and mobility specialist? How do we provide access to the Common Core standards? And that universal design, hint, 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 is used with fidelity. If you look at the Tier 2, it's like maybe receiving some targeted supports in academic areas. And in Tier 3, it's much more of an expanded core curriculum where oftentimes you're looking at specific instruction on how to use technical assistance. What kind of self-advocacy do students like this need, and how do we coach them? How do we look at career and social skills counseling? Braille is a very specific skill set, and that's often taught by a Braille teacher in conjunction with other things. So again, it's something that has to be looked at from a multi-level, need-based situation. There still are specialty schools out there, especially for our students who have the wherewithal that they are dealing with multiple issues. A parent friend of mine has a son who was born both deaf and blind with physical disabilities, and his son actually goes to a special school in order to keep all of the needs in mind. So it's a continuum. If you haven't seen it before, this is what the Braille alphabet and numbers look like. We do see them in places and spaces in our everyday life. Can you name one place? So you've seen this before. We've talked about how this looks like with universal design and the Common Core standards. Take a moment to read that far left column. So this is a 5th grade reading standard for fluency. When we look at creating a lesson for a student, in some respects, you're looking at the outcome here, because what's the verb in that first main standard? It's read. In order to provide multiple representations, the second column from the right, which says multiple representation, you see low vision and you also see blindness. There are things that we can provide to support our students. It might be a magnifier. It might be large print. A computer screen, if you look at how we can enlarge text. And the important thing is for them to be able to have really clean, bold print to read. When you talk about a student who does not have sufficient vision to be able to read print, the options are things like Braille, audiobooks, a voice synthesizer, or some sort of voice-activated device. That's how we represent the print in order to provide them a way to show us how to read with accuracy. Engagement, if you again look at this, it's how do we support students in any type of reading goal to understand the context of what they're reading. We may have a discussion. We may look at writing stories or poetry. We may focus on the meaning in a direct teaching moment. We may talk about choral reading. We may provide someone who sits and reads. Again, with someone who does not have the reading visual ability, there are other ways of providing opportunities to create storytelling. Assessment is how do we know what the outcome is? In other words, how do we know that we've reached that standard? And again, for both, there are multiple types of opportunities in order to present information that comprehension of the material is there. 2 ideas, reading journals and dramatizations. This is a math standard, pretty complex. It's about graphing, X and Y coordinates. I'm going to leave this for you to take a look at and review, okay? You're on your best, you're on your honor. So go back to this and look at this. With fidelity, you'll understand a little bit more about presenting information, providing opportunities to engage with that information, and also what the assessment might look like. So the other types of educational needs, right, for these students are daily living skills. Again, it's about how do we teach them the things that they need to know to what ultimately is our goal is to create someone who has the ability to be independent, happy adults. Orientation and mobility is about having to make, adjustments, personal adjustments. What kind of sensory efficiency skills? In other words, what kind of things do they need to pick up, maybe using their hearing to compensate for what they are in terms of moving about in the world. I'm going to cough and I must apologize. As with any of our students, we really want to provide them ways in which we teach them self-determination. How do we know what we know and then advocate for what we need going out into the world? It is really a goal-directed focus, and it's really how we, as people who negotiate the world with far fewer learning challenges, are successful. We have to partner with families and professionals and physicians in the community in ways in which we can provide services to go forward. Remember again, at any time in this lecture, you need to stop, walk away, get a cup of coffee, do your thing. Hey, isn't that cool? So when we talk about really young children, we really want to emphasize that the curriculum is about real experiences, hands-on, meaningful object manipulation, because this is one way that we learn about the world around us. And we really have to flood these children with these kinds of experiences. Object permanence is something in child development that is really a sequence within development that's really necessary in order to go forward, to make the world in a much more orderly and predictable way. Things don't disappear just because you cannot see them in a typical developing child when we talk about object permanence. You have to deliberately create instructional practice to organize the environment so that children understand what this is, especially if they have visual acuity issues or blind. We have to focus on playing skills, again, interacting, making sure that children do not pull away from the world around them. Because again, if you cannot see what's going on, you will tend to pull away from that. And for security reasons, one of my students talked about as an adult how he really felt in many ways quite isolated unless he made the effort to go out and, as he said, put himself out there. Parents are really an important piece of this. So a lot of times in early childhood practices, we involve the parent quite heavily on what they need to do in addition to what's going on in the child's educational process. Elementary, middle school, accommodations to develop basic skills. And again, it goes back to what does that student need in order to be a successful learner? Those are things that are done as a result of assessment, etc. And how they learn and we learn as educators the appropriate learning medium for them to be successful. I've had students who have had low vision who were taught Braille as a way, in case they lost all of their vision, that they might have another avenue to accessing information. As an adult, the student that I have in mind, I'm thinking of him right now, is he very rarely uses Braille because his vision is such where he can really use a magnifier, a super large print in order to access material in his, for example, his computer. But he did learn Braille as a child. What we want to do is emphasize all of those things that make us complete individuals: social skills, our sexuality, our self-help skills, how we be self-advocates, how we acknowledge each other, and also the knowledge of one's own learning challenge, right? Go back to the idea in Monica and David, how neither of those individuals, and again, they were children with intellectual disabilities, adults with intellectual disabilities, had not been afforded really what their challenge was and what they needed to really self-advocate. During this time in elementary and middle school, orientation and mobility continues. When we talk about secondary school and then transition into adulthood, again, it's what we've spoken about across the board with all of our learners. Daily living skills. What are the social skills that they need to be successful? Are they going to be able to be independent livers, and what we need to do to be able to do that? Seeking jobs, seeking out family support and involvement, and learning how to navigate safely through unfamiliar and new environments. In view of educational placements, if you look at it for most of the time, you're looking at least 64% of our students are included within regular classrooms most of the day. And when they're not included, more than likely, you're looking at the types of things that they need to be involved with mobility or learning Braille or other types of skills that they may be in a separate setting. Measuring students' progress is the same as general education. Many of the students take the same math, social studies, language arts, and science tests as their peers. What the accommodations that are necessary and what you will see listed in their individual education plans are the types of accommodations. In other words, do we have to transcribe print material into Braille? Do we have to provide handouts electronically in order for things to be enlarged? Additional time needed? Other types of technology tools? And that's really the crux of measuring student progress. So some of the general considerations when you talk about working with students who respond in Braille is that there has to be a translator there who writes in print exactly as it was written in Braille, to provide all sorts of things for spelling tests, for math skills tests, etc. Student skill levels are often looked at from what we call informal measures, teacher observation, what kind of curriculum-based tests need to be done. And teachers have to have that knowledge of the kind of skill development. And that's where dealing with the visual impairment specialist or other related service people really is super important. Because again, it has to do with some of that skill level because of the incidental learning that these kids may or may not be able to take cues from. Your exit ticket today is going to be a series of questions. It's not long. It will be about possibly evaluating students, planning for universal design, curriculum and instruction strategies. So when you're done watching this video lecture, go back, review that. Again, the class notes will be in Blackboard separately for your use. And I think that's almost it. Before I leave you, what I want you to make sure that you have done, because it is part of your exit ticket also, is there are 2 videos on Blackboard. Make sure you view both of them. They're basically entitled, "What do you do when you meet a blind person?" So again, I leave you. Enjoy, take breaks, do whatever you need to do. The assignment is brief responses. It should not be bigger or longer than 1 page double-spaced. Check your grammar because it's important and it's due next Sunday. So all in all, please take care. I will see you soon in our next session. So enjoy, and hopefully you will be safe and be well.